So we're gonna do a hike through hooks and suspense in React. I'm Tony. I'm at Ubert, all the places that matter. And the link to the slides is at the bottom. All right. If you can't hear me, let me know. I'm also gonna try to record this, so it should be posted later. And by later, I mean like a month from now when I actually edit it. All right, so hooks. How many people, before I get started with that, are familiar with React today? Most of you? Okay, cool. I can like hand wave past a bunch of stuff. So hooks. So there's a big question as to why. Like class components worked, everybody liked them, kind of. So the reason for hooks is a lot of people weren't using class components. They were using just vanilla, plain old functional components. But when you use a function as your component, like you lose a bunch of abilities. So like you lose all lifecycle hooks, you lose state. So the React team, the core team, came up with this idea of hooks, which brings functional components and class components closer in parity of functionality. It also allows you to do state inside of functional components. They allow you to do custom hooks to allow you to do more reuse. And then the biggest thing for the React team is they had a hard time optimizing class components. There is a lot of magic that happens with that syntax, and for them to do certain things within that magic and to kind of optimize that magic became really difficult for them. So they came up with hooks. We'll dive into those a little bit here in a minute. Suspense, on the other hand, is a way to make doing asynchronous coding easier. And on top of that, it allows the React team to do some magic with rendering. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but essentially they can start pausing the rendering loop and doing smart things there. So we'll hit that up in a little bit. All right. So far, this is what's been released in the API for hooks. Use state allows you to hold state. Use effect is your kind of go-to lifecycle hook. So it has similar to on component did mount and did mount and on component will unmount. Use context is an easier way to get access to things held in context. So if you're familiar with Redux, Redux is passed around inside of a context. And we'll explore that a little bit more later. Use reducer is just what it sounds like. It's a reducer. It's a Redux style reducer. Use callback and use memo are pretty close to the same thing. You give it a function and some values, and it stores that value. And every time it gets called, it checks to see if the value's changed. If it hasn't, it just gives you back the results from the last time it was used. Use ref is a hook for refs. And then use imperative handler is a complicated thing that I haven't figured out a use for. It basically allows you to use a ref on a parent component, but I don't know why you would do that. And then use layout effect is similar to use effect, except use effect runs after render and use layout effect runs during render. So one is more asynchronous and use layout effect is more synchronous. And use debug value is when you're writing custom hooks, you can then put debug values into your code and get access to them in the tooling. All right. So there's a couple of rules when it comes to hooks. You can only use hooks at the top of your functions, otherwise React gets really confused. They always must be called in the same order. So if you have 3 use state hooks in a row, they always need to be in that same order. And they can't be within if blocks. And they must be called from either a React function or a custom hook function. And that's pretty much the only rules. So far for suspense, as of today, this is the only APIs that have released is suspense and lazy. The main use here, which we'll demo in a little bit, is to lazy load components and break out bundles from there. All right, now demos. We're gonna do this thing where I attempt to like pseudo live code. It's gonna be great, I promise. Can everybody read the code on the, okay? All right. So demo one, like,
If you could leave it bigger.
yes.
If you could zoom in a little, that would probably help. Although I might just be blind.
Oh, way, way back.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
If you can read it, I think we're good.
It's not mechanical.
See, and then it's got to be in WebStorm where like the actual zooms don't work the same way as other editors. Oh no. There it goes.
Check that box.
Yep, thanks. I'd have figured it out eventually. That didn't make it any bigger. Oh, WebStorm.
I think Roman just needs to move closer.
All right.
Yeah, that's fine.
Sorry, Roman. This is the one thing I hate about WebStorm is it doesn't zoom text. Anyways, my apologies. Anyways, so this is a really simple demo. It has a button. We push it. It counts. Wow. So here we can just get a little taste of hooks, and you'll see a lot of this as we go. So we have a React component, our functional component. We call useState. We give that state an initial value. It can be a string, it can be an object, it can be whatever you want. It gives back an array where we deconstruct it into the value, and it gives you back two things, the value and a function to set the value. So we display the value, and when we click on click, we call the set count plus one. Like, pretty straightforward. All right, now we're gonna get a little clever. So now we're gonna click around on the screen. It's gonna do a thing, and if you're really clever, you'll notice that in the console log, like every time I click, it outputs more and more console.logs. Yeah, let's talk about that. So here again, you say useState. I'm giving it a string this time, which is the position, the x and y coordinates. Same thing as before, position, set position. Now we're bringing in useEffect, which allows us to do, useEffect is really meant for doing activities that affect the DOM. In this case, we want to subscribe to an event on mouse up. On mouse up, and whenever that says, we want to call our event handler. And our event handler is just outputting that event to the console and setting the position. So you'll notice, like I said before, like every time we click, it's doing like more and more logs each time. So useEffect has a couple of neat features which we're going to explore through a couple of these demos. One of them is so the basic of every time this renders, the useEffect is getting called, which is causing it to subscribe to that event listener again. That's why it's showing up more and more times. And you'll notice too, if we switch to a different page and click, like, it's still outputting the log. Like, we never unsubscribed from that thing. So the return value of a useEffect is the method you want React to call when to clean up whatever you're doing. So if you subscribe to 10 different mouse events, you could unsubscribe them in the return. Come on, there we go.
So like it's called like at the very beginning of the next render, or when does that return actually happen?
You can think of it like that.
Okay.
It's not exactly right after or right before the next render, because it's asynchronous, React will eventually get to it, but essentially that's the flow. It calls the use effect right away, and then the next render, it'll clean up whatever was there before, and then it'll run the new use effect. So you'll see we should only ever get one now. If we leave this page, like, we don't get any more. There is a there's a second argument that comes with use effect. So here we have a nice text box. When we hit reload, we want the cursor to go in the first name, like good user experience, so the user can just start typing. You'll see that we're holding first name, last name, and we're using use ref now. And I'll get into that second argument in a second. So use ref is like ref is today. It's just a hook. We want to set the focus element to this input by just setting the ref. And then inside of the use effect block, we say focus element.current, that's focus. Basically, we're manipulating the DOM to set the focus to that text box. That's why. But this has a side effect. Because use effect runs on every render, if I start typing in last name, it's going to render again and move that cursor. So use effect takes in two arguments. The effect and the values you want it to watch to know if it should run that effect again. In this case, we're inputting a blank array that essentially says only run this once. But if you had props that were inputted into your function and you want that effect to run every time those props come in, because it needs to set something up, you would put those in there, which we'll see more examples of this in a bit, but you would put this in there, and what React will do is do a diff on the values you give it, and if the values are different from one render to another, it will run the effect. If they're the same, it won't run the effect again. So let me get rid of this. We'll run the example with a blank array. Everybody will be wowed by the fact that the cursor doesn't magically change spots. And we can type in that text box. I know, amazing. All right. We're starting slow. It gets better.
I can hardly
All right, demo 4. So demo 4, we basically have a hold on, gotta remember how my demo works. So demo 4 is this idea of having an interval in React. So one of the things that's kind of hard to do, and this one's sort of super convoluted, but you get to start to see how some of these arguments come together, is we want to start and then just have a timer tick, and when it ticks, you know, we just want it to count up on each interval. But you'll notice that we just get stuck at 1 here. So what's happening is hold on. Hold on, my brain just forgot. Okay. So what we're trying to do here is when we click start, we're creating a new interval, and we have a handler that sets count and a timer of 1,000 milliseconds, so every 1 second. The problem is this interval is running, but it never sees the new value of count, because count is part of the render process. So when this re-renders, that set interval doesn't get updated. So this is where some things start to get really interesting, because we're going to create a custom hook called use interval. And we're going to comment out the other stuff. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. We're going to let it re-render or reload. And now we're going to see it count up really, really fast.
That's not a second.
No, the set to 100 milliseconds now. All right, so now we can take a look at the magic that's kind of happening. All right, use interval. So this is kind of what a custom hook will look like. We have the callback that we want to run, and we have the delay, right? So we're saying use ref, saved callback. We're saying use ref has this amazing ability to also be used for values that you want to hold on to across renders. So it doesn't just need to be for references. If you want to instantiate an instance of, say, a markdown render, and you don't want it renderer, and you don't want to create that instance on every render, you can create it once, put it into a reference, and that current will be a pointer to the same instance of that thing. In this case, we're pointing it at, or we're setting it equal to the callback that we give it. So therefore, we can always get access to that callback. If you remember above, our callback is basically set count, count plus 1. And then we have another use effect. And we have a function called tick. And we have a function, and we're saying if not delayed, then so if there's a delay, we set the interval called tick on each interval, and then we'll clean up the effect by clearing the interval. And we're saying only run this effect every time the delay is different. So if we kind of look at our custom hook up here, here's our callback, and then we're saying if it's active, give it 100. If it's not active, give it null. So that's what turns it on and off and cleans up that interval or not cleans up that interval.
So could you use that same use interval like with two instances with the same delay, or would that override, or since you're actually setting it separately,
Yep.
they would run separately?
That is a good question. You can reuse custom hooks. I'm debating in my head right now if this particular one can be reused.
Either way, you could just by adding the
Yep.
callback to
Would they have to be in a separate component then? You can only use
No. So you can use effect or use state or use reducer. You can use them all as many times as you want. And the magic that React does is it basically uses the order that you've called them in as the way it stores it. So if you call use state, it knows index 1 of some array somewhere is the value for that hook. And then if you call it again, then index 2 is the value for that hook. So that's why they need to be in order, is because React is optimizing on that. In this case, I think you'd be okay, but I'm not entirely sure. And the only reason I'm questioning it is because of the use ref that's in here. But I think it would be okay because of how React does it, or gets values on the order. If that makes sense.
Sure.
All right. All right. Demo 5. I don't remember. Wrong thing. Okay, let's try that again, but on the right side. Demo 5. So now we're going to get into context. So like, there's a whole Redux store that's hidden behind here. If you're doing class components or functional components before hooks, what you would do is you would use connect to have your Redux state passed in as props and your actions passed in as props. You can access the context directly with use context. You pass in the React Redux context. It gives you a store. The store has a getState method. It has a dispatch method. So nothing terribly exciting when I push this button, like the count goes up. What it's doing is on click, we're saying handle click, which is just doing a store.dispatch and passing in an action. On the display, we're doing store.getState and looking for a value of count. So same Redux pattern, just a different way to access it. One of the ways where reuse context comes into play a lot is where people will use it for theming and other assorted UI elements to say like, oh, you're in dark mode or you're in light mode. Before you would have to have these DOM trees that were indented because every use context had to be a new indentation. Now you can just do one single hook that says, give me the context for theme color. And then you can render based on that context. And then if you have multiple contexts, they don't all need to be indented inside of each other. Use context is one of the bigger areas where things have cleaned up immensely. Demo 6. Oh, did you see it? I didn't warn you. So demo 6 is the first suspense. So if you watch closely, it's going to say loading. Oh my goodness. And then it's going to say I was loaded. So what it's doing, is saying, we're lazy loading the component I was lazy loading. So that is, through some Webpack magic, is bundled in a separate module bundle from the main JS bundle. When the page loads, it makes a request to go get that JavaScript and load it. If you're on a fast connection, like you barely see it happen, like it's a flicker. If you're on a slow connection, it will fall back to a loading widget. So where suspense comes in really handy is you no longer have to code those yourself. React will help you control that. So before we explain the code, like if we look at the component, like the actual loaded component looks like any other component you would ever write. However, the loading of this component has two things that are very different. So on line 2 here, we're calling react.lazy, and we're giving it an import. This import is part of it is part of the TC39 spec for JavaScript to do lazy loading. It is also baked into Webpack, so what it will do automatically is separate those two bundles apart. React then wraps it in its own lazy implementation and allows you to use it as part of suspense. So here we've wrapped that component in a suspense block. We give it a fallback component that says, if you're waiting for that component to load this other thing. Once it's loaded, then switch out the component. So that's all that needs to happen for components to use the suspense API and switch to the loading indicator. This gets way more fun, as we'll talk about later, with concurrent React, which is not yet released.
There's nothing else in Webpack I have to configure to do that.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I'm using Create React app for these demos. I didn't touch anything. It just worked.
Never go.
If you have a custom Webpack, like there might be something.
Yep.
What other properties are available for that suspense component?
Today, nothing.
Okay.
We're going to jump ahead a little since you asked the question. In tomorrow's land with concurrent React, you'll be able to give it a timeout. And basically what it'll do is you don't have to give it a timeout either. What React will do is if it's waiting like a few hundred milliseconds, it'll choose to not render anything. If it's over that timeout, then it'll render the fallback component. And if the component it's waiting for loads before the timeout, it'll just load that. If it loads after the timeout, it'll take away the fallback component, and then load the regular component. So that is coming, but that's not there today. I mean, it's there today, but it's behind a flag. All right. Demo 7. Oh, look, we're loading again. So part of this talk, I wanted to get into some of the clever parts of this. So one of the first things about hooks that was clever is it's essentially needs to be in order, and the reason it needs to be in order is because that's how React is paying attention to how things are stored and how it should reload it on a render. Suspense, a little bit clever, way more clever than that. So the way suspense works is, this is demo displays that. So we're gonna get into the answer to that question. I was too far ahead of myself. Again, we have a suspense component with a fallback loading. We have a demo component 7, and then this is our demo component. We're going to start at the bottom, and we're returning a div that says I finally rendered. Okay, so the magic in suspense. Are you ready? Because it's not really that complicated. All they do is throw a promise. That's it. The suspense component waits for that promise to resolve. When it's resolved, it renders the child component as it was given. There's a couple of gotchas here. There are cases where it will try to render your component even though it's not ready to be rendered yet. If that happens, the exact same instance of that promise needs to be thrown. Once the promise is finished, then you resolve the promise and React goes, oh, okay, I can render this now. So in this code, you'll see, hey, is there a promise? This is very don't write this code. This is just demoing how this works. I'll show you a better version later. So you have this new promise. We have a timeout just to fake a loading of 5 seconds. And then when it's finished, we set some flag to true, and then we resolve the promise. We have that flag so we know if we should throw the promise again or not. All right, and as you already saw, if we rerun this, it shows loading, and then it finally resolves. As far as what ships today, that's how suspense works. The magic of how React knows when that promise is resolved, I've never found that code. I found the code of where it throws the promise. So there's magic happening in the reconciler for rendering. Couldn't tell you what that looks like. All right, demo 8. One of the things that you can use an effect for, so we're going to jump back in the hooks for a second, then we're going to put all this stuff together. One of the things that you can do with effect is you can do asynchronous operations. Today, it is a place to do that. Tomorrow, once suspense becomes more mature and those patterns become better, you'll probably use that to do your asynchronous data fetches. This is an example of how to use an effect to do it. You may not do this in the future just because there may be better patterns. So we have a set state or a use state with some just random data. Right now it's null. We have a use effect called getData. We have a method that fakes a request for 2 seconds and then sets the data. We have a very ugly is data. If not, return, or if there's no data, return null. If there's data, then just show the data. As you saw before, it doesn't render anything for a minute, and then it renders some stuff. That's how you would use effects to do it. If you don't want the data or the get data to run on every render, you would pass in some inputs to tell React when you should use that effect. So if your get data is dependent on properties that are passed in and you only want to get it when properties are changed, you would just put them here. And this is an array, so you can pass in as many as you want. All right. Putting it all together. So in my sleep-deprived state a couple months ago after seeing a lot of this, I was curious if you couldn't create a custom action for Redux that invoked suspense that you could use in line. I said a lot of words. I get it. So we created a custom action of get data. It takes in a dispatch and a get state. It's kind of looks like every other Redux action you've ever written, a little bit. I fake a request by putting it to sleep, and then once it's done, I dispatch some payload. Like, right? So then we have our suspense wrapper. We have a fallback and a component called demo9. All right. Demo9. We're going to start at the bottom again. We're going to use the normal connect methods here. So we're map states props. We don't have any mapped action in the props. And we're getting our map states props 8.drive data. Okay. So we're using this custom action that I wrote called useSync async action, and we're giving it the data. What you use async action is doing, and we'll walk through it in a second, is checking to see if that action has been dispatched yet. If it's not, it's creating a promise for it. It's calling that action, it's throwing that promise, and waiting for it to resolve. And then invoking suspense in the process. Now, let's look at that. All right, so this is going to get just fun. Okay, so right off the bat, we're going to get the Redux context, or the Redux context. We're going to need that because that's what we're going to use to dispatch the action. We are going to create a hash real quick so that we know any other time this is called, we can distinguish between uses because we're going to store off the promise by the object hash. Hey, look, we're going to check to see if that hash already exists in our promise lookup. If it doesn't exist, we're going to create another one. We're going to call that function that we were given. We're going to give that function dispatch and get state and pass along any arguments that were given to us. That function must return a promise. We're going to then on that promise, assuming that promise is in the lookup, when it's completed, we're just going to mark it as done. And then we're going to store off that promise in our lookup and set done to false. If for some reason that component re-renders and comes back into here, we're going to take a look at it and go, hey, you exist already. You're not done, so I'm just going to rethrow you. Let suspense take care of you. Oh, we come down into the fun part. We have this use effect that only runs if the arguments that were given to us change. And it doesn't really do anything except clean itself up. So when it cleans up, we're going to check that promise array, look for that hash. If it's in there, we're just going to remove it. Therefore, you can run it again. And that way, if you ever come back to that page, you can have that asynchronous action kick off again. And then usync async actions is a variant of that. It allows you to pass in multiple actions at once. I'm not saying this is like the best solution. This is me learning how to use suspense and hooks together. It was fun to write. I wrote it because if you go read the issues for React Redux. They're in this nebulous state currently with how to implement hooks and how to get data from hooks and how to implement suspense and call actions and stuff. There's actually a couple of bugs in the current, well, I shouldn't say this because I haven't looked recently, but when I wrote this, there were a couple of bugs in React Redux because of the new releases with hooks and suspense, where I haven't hit the bugs, but apparently they exist because they're unsure of like how to use the new context and how to like keep things in order. I don't know. It was fun to write. I was really excited about it, but it kind of brings a bunch of aspects of this together. All right. Going back over here. So now we're going to talk about some things that are coming down the pipeline. React Cache is actually released-ish. You can install it, but it's React's team's way of doing asynchronous, suspenseful data loading. So you give it an API or a method to call. You give it does create resource. And then when you do a read on that resource, it essentially does everything I just talked about. If it hasn't loaded data yet for that ID, it's going to throw a promise. It's going to call the fetch that you gave it. It's going to wait for it to come back, and then it'll re-render your stuff all using the suspense API. This is the code where I learned how suspense worked, because that code I could actually understand, where the React code, like there's magic in that code. This is labeled as coming soon because it is not documented as far as the React team. You can find people who are using it and they've documented it, but it's officially not released for public consumption. But Facebook uses it all over the place. So do with that as you will. There's another module called the platform, which is a dig at Polymer. And what they did is they wrapped pretty much all of the native APIs for the browser in hooks, or made them suspense enabled. So all the used ones are hooks. It'll allow you to, it'll do the hookup and, or the subscribe and unsubscribe to those APIs for you, and give you a way to get that data. And then all of the image, script, video tags are all suspense enabled tags, where it will lazy load your images, and if you're inside of a suspense block, it'll wait till they're loaded before it tries to render that component. This one's labeled coming soon on my own accord. It's like the module itself is all documented on how to use it. This relies on suspense and concurrent React, and per the React team, like some of that isn't fully baked yet, so there might be changes, so this might change. It's just a word of caution. Be ready for change in this particular case. Okay, concurrent React, going back to your question. If you want to enable concurrent React, that's how you do it. So the magic in concurrent React is today, when you render, it renders the entire component tree. And then once it's done, it loops back and does it again. Concurrent React is going to do some magic to figure out low priority components to render and high priority components to render. And what it will do is make assumptions based on that of when it can stop rendering mid-cycle and either start over again or go render high priority things and then come back to where it was and keep rendering. Essentially, the goal is to have responsive pages. So if you have something that's minor, that doesn't need to be re-rendered, like React can put that low priority and get to it when it gets to it. But if you have, say, like a drag and drop thing on your page, you want that to render every time, so you get that smooth animation. Like React can start to figure out, okay, this I always do, this other stuff over here I can wait on. If you want to play around with it today, it's behind the unstable flag. It will look like that at some point. All right, so getting into the summary of this. One of the questions, if you watch the React talks from ReactConf in October, is you're going to ask yourself, is classes dead? The short answer is no. There's a couple of things that you can't do in hooks or in functional components yet. You can't do air boundaries in functional components yet, and you can't do, I don't remember the other thing. But as far as classes, if they're dead, the way that the React team talked about it, even though they said no, I feel like they're not going to push them much after they get them in exact parity, so keep that in mind. The team is really excited about it. The next question, since there's a use reducer hook, is going to be, is Redux dead? Once again, I don't think so, officially. There's some magic you can use with Redux, and there's some resources in here that you can go read up on later. Right now, using Redux is you still get all the tooling support with Redux, so all the middleware and all of the browser extensions to do just-in-time debugging. With use reducer, you lose all of that. So I don't think Redux itself is going to die. But it may have a smaller use case because it can be, parts of it can be used with use reducer. One of the things I want to address with hooks and suspense is there's this little bit of magic that's happening. So one of my personal preferences towards React is I'm writing JavaScript. It looks like JavaScript to me. There's not a lot of special APIs. If I look at, say, Vue, for example, there's a lot of special APIs, and I'm coding to those APIs. So with hooks and suspense, you're starting to rely on somebody else's magic more. In this case, now that I have dug into this, and hopefully through this talk you have a better understanding of how it works, there's less magic, so therefore it's not as big of a deal. But like we're moving away from quote-unquote pure JavaScript. And then the last question that comes up is this production ready? So classes are totally fine still. Like non-hooks functional components are totally fine. Is hooks and suspense production ready? The answer is yes. If you want to use it today, you can. My only word of caution is this stuff is still very new. A lot of the patterns and practices and best use cases for it are still being evolved over time, or still being evolved. So the best way to do something today with hooks and suspense may be different tomorrow. So if you go into that knowing that, like, and you're okay with having to update your code later, then I would say go for it. If you're a little bit more risk adverse, you may want to wait a little bit longer just to see some of these patterns get fleshed out. With that said, hooks and suspense are going to be the things that are pushed as the standard way to work in React going forward. So you will have to make the jump at some point, or it would be advisable to make the jump at some point. And then at the end here, we'll get into that in a second. There's a bunch of resources that you can read. Dan Abramoff has written on his blog a bunch of good stuff that goes in depth on some things we touched on about how to write defensive components and resilient components, and a complete guide to how use effect works and the magic that is there. Highly recommend reading them. They're like 50-minute reads individually, so good stuff. And the slides and the demo code is at that link too. All right, I talked for a lot. Do you have any questions?
I got one.
Yes.
So I noticed in one of your examples that you had 2 use states in a row.
Yes.
Is there a reason why you would do that instead of having just a single use state with like a single object that you pass in instead?
For my demo, it was easier to show like this is how you use multiple assembling.
Okay.
It would depend on your use case. So you may have 2 pieces of the data that are unrelated. So you might want them to be in different use states. If they're related in some way and you want them to be connected, then you could use one. So like if you had a widget A and a widget, no, that's a bad example. If you had an order and a user, you might not hold those two things together because they're going to be set at different times. But if you had like items in the order, maybe something like that. Yeah.
Because set functions then just replace the objects. That would be the only thing I would think. Where if you have some complex object, you have to keep track of all of it in order to set it all. Unlike like set state, you can just set a specific piece of it. Whereas
Yes.
if it's just replacing the whole thing, having them separately.
So the set object does is a full set. So you have to give it the full complete object every time.
Alternatively, you can give set state a function that takes the previous state and you can mutate the state.
You're right. I just learned about that API like 2 weeks ago. So it's not in this talk because the talk was created like 2 months ago. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
What types of things are you thinking about when you're deciding when should I use suspense here or when should I not use suspense? Do you just grab through suspense or just asynchronous things?
So for me going forward, it's going to be where do I want that loading spinner to show up or that loading indicator? So the demo that the React team did when they demoed it, they had like 15 spinners show up on the page, and it was really kind of ugly. So it's finding out where you want that page to wait and where you want that page to load independently. So you may not want like 15 child components all have spinners. You may want to have some parent up the tree to wait. So that's where that's starting to come together, is what do you want that user experience to be? And do you want the user to be able to interact with this even though this other one's still waiting, or do you want the whole thing to just wait until it's there? If that makes good sense. As far as using it or not using it, I would say to start toying around with it, because it makes it so you don't have to do things like if null, then render nothing, because that always annoyed me. I mean, there is better patterns today to do that, but a lot of people just fall back to if null. And it makes it a lot easier because I can rely on the engine to do it, or the framework to do it, and then I don't have to worry about it as much. Because as a developer, I'm lazy by heart, or lazy at heart. Any other questions?
Yeah, so in all of your examples, we have the custom hooks in your components. When we're using them in a bigger project, how do you architect that? Where do you put them?
They don't need to be in your components. They can be wherever you want. You can just import them.
Any ideas? Anything that's worked best for you?
I haven't used this in a large project yet. So I run a website called devwi.com. It's essentially a Meetup calendar right now. When I wrote it, so I rewrote it after learning hooks and suspense. Every component is written a different way. It looks like I was crazy when I wrote it, but I was toying with it. So, like, I don't have an answer to that yet. And I don't know that I would have an answer for that, just because organization is highly tuned to the project. My guess is you'll start holding similar custom hooks together, much like you do components today, and start grouping them that way. But one of the cool things that's coming with custom hooks is you're going to be able to ship ship logic easier for components. So I don't know if he's done this yet. I know he's giving a talk at the React Meetup. So Ryan Florence is creating the Reach UI toolkit. And one of the things he's excited about is he'll be able to ship custom component or custom hooks for his components that allows the developer to have accessible components easier, because he'll be able to ship the hook that allows that to happen along with it. Because there is some developer interaction that needs, code that needs to be written for that interaction to be successful. So he'll be able to give an API on top of the components with extra functionality like accessibility. Yeah.
Have you done much testing with this? It feels like since they're pure functional components, it should be pretty straightforward, but are there any gotchas with how React does its magic?
I've not done a lot of testing. So my personal site has no tests. I'm a horrible person. Don't code like me. I haven't been able to use it at work yet with tests. According to what I've read, they should be fairly straightforward. You run enzyme tests or render tests like you would, and it should just work. And then when you test the hooks, what did they say about the hooks? I think you can run them as just regular old tests. They may need to be wrapped in something, but I don't recall off the top of my head. But they were adamant that they were just as easy to test as everything else. But I can't confirm nor deny. Anything else? Yeah.
Did you see any browser-related things? You shouldn't, but I'm just curious if there's anything that you have noticed. Browser-related stuff.
As far as I know, no. I haven't seen anything. I mean, I ran it in Chrome and Firefox. And I mean, it's JavaScript at the end of the day. So they're not relying on any special APIs or magic. I mean, they wrote their own magic. But at the end of the day, it's just JavaScript. Yeah.
And you know when the tools will support hooks?
I don't know the exact date. I saw some tweets about them recently from Dan and some of the other Facebook teams. They're either coming soon or were released recently. They're apparently pretty badass, but I don't know what that means. The tweets said they were badass. Yeah?
I liked your slide
That's
covers.
That's what happens when you get bored creating a slide deck. Like, what can I do? Anyways, any other questions? No? All right, I'll be around for a while. I have some That Conference stickers up here if you want those. My sticker collection is low at the moment, so. All right, thank you.